Hello and welcome back to Genesis Designs and Modelcraft. And here on the bench I have Bare Naked Build 2, the Italeri 148 F-35B Lightning. And as you can see, I have reduced it to an airframe and a pile of bits. So you may recall from the previous build video that I used ammo ultra glue to put a lot of the parts on, and this shows you the extent of that. All of these parts were initially assembled to the model with ammo's ultra glue, and some of them were really difficult to get off. I'm very impressed with this glue. I previously only really used it for transparencies and putting photo etch on things. I think I'll probably use it a bit more now after this, because I say some of these parts were really difficult to get off. Once they are off though, as you can see possibly here, there is glue residue. It leaves itself behind, but you can just piggle it off, just like when you get a free gift on the front of a magazine. It's quite similar, although not as sticky, but it does peel off no issues. So I shall be doing that. A lot of prep work to do, so I need to peel off all the glue and sand the seams on the parts that need it. But just for reference, this is our start point, and I'm going to do something cool with it, because the standard decal schemes are not terrifically exciting. Here we've got one for 207 OCU, except it's got a Dam Buster's lightning strike on the tail. But I don't suppose these aircraft are specifically allocated to the various squadrons, in fairness. There'll be a pool of them and the different squadrons will just use them. So this one, another one for 617 with or without the lightning on the tail. I will admit this one's passingly attractive, and the Americans have made an effort there. Bit of colour involved. I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't aware that colour was so reflective to radar. Yeah, yeah, low vis one, still not really very interesting. And then an Italian low vis one. They're all, let's not mince words, they're all pretty damn boring. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to do something a little bit more interesting with it. A what if you will. Now, I don't know, everyone's got a different threshold for what ifing. I don't mind a plausible what if. You know, if you're going to take a Messerschmitt 109 and strap some rocket engines on it and a few forward swept wings and call it a thing, I'm pretty much going to just walk away from that, because it's just silly. Enjoyable modelling perhaps, but silly. But if you take a proper model and apply something to it that wouldn't normally be seen, might be made up, but is at least plausible, that's a whole different matter. I remember once seeing a whole bunch of illustrations posted up, I think it was through Brit Modeler, it was all the years ago, where someone had done a load of side profile illustrations of various different aircraft in all kinds of crazy schemes, like an English Electric Lightning in sort of Castrol racing colours, or US Navy colours, things like that, and a lot of them just looked absolutely fantastic, and I'm a big fan of that kind of what if. This isn't going to be quite as far out as that, but it certainly isn't going to be standard dull, slightly reflective grey with even more dull markings on it. So I'll get on with the prep and I'll pop back in as and when. Alright, we're maybe 2.5 hours after I recorded that first bit, and I'm actually very close to being ready with this, so I'll just show you where I've been and what I've been up to. So the wing seams, this is how it looked. They were very similar, and this is how it is after filler. You can see there's very little actual filler in there. I've used the black super glue so it's easy to see. This is AK's Black Widow with talc in it, so it's a little easier to sand. Very little actual filling media left in there. This part here sanded off, no filler, same there. And then the nose, which was our tricky area if you recall, the sort of chine itself is fine, and I've this area here as well all done, and I've sharpened that up a little bit, so thinned out the flat sort of edge that was on that. And as you can see, there is a touch of filler just in that front edge. I need to check a couple pictures, see if I need to scribe that back in or not. And then this side, which was worse, also a little filler. You can see it in the gap there, and then filling the step here. And what that's done is it's essentially come level now with this piece of raised detail. But if I try to get that correct, I'm going to lose that. There's no way around it. So what I've done actually is just scribed that line back in, because once it's masked and painted a different colour, it will become a lot less obvious that it is now flush. So the only parts that are left for me to fill in the conventional manner or sand is this part and this wing seam. And then I shall go around, and all these areas on the underside, the wing joints, the door joints, the undercarriage doors, they'll all get the Vallejo putty and cotton bud treatment. The radome, I've just sanded it wherever it was proud. I've sanded it down and I've left it at that, and that'll be Vallejo'd as well. And there were two really prominent thin raised bits of detail there that I've just taken off because they looked awful, honestly, so I've just got rid of them completely. So that's the main aircraft, and these are the various parts that are ready. This is what's left to fix up. The jet pipe, got rid of the seam on that, and I've just dubbed random rivets back in with the pounce wheel on there because these are raised. Just sort of giving that all a, just carved these a little bit because they didn't meet up flush. Got sort of a wedge effect going on, so I carved them to meet up properly and just sanded that out. None of these parts needed anything special. The weapons sanded up beautifully because they did fit together well. And the wheel, I've just spent way too much time deepening the tread. So as it comes, it's a little bit, it's not very good detail. It's a bit shallow and indistinct, obviously because of being on what is a vertical face for the mould tool, so it can't have deep tread in it, and the treads in these tyres are relatively deep. So I used the scriber, this one, to very carefully work my way around the tread to create an engraved line, and then I used the JLC. This thing is worth its weight in gold and then some because it's not very heavy. Razor saw, really good bit of kit. I've had this for several years. I'm still on the first blade. You can cut metal with it, you can cut plastic with it, and it's also really good for making square engravings in round surfaces. So I used this to deepen the lines once I've made them, and it's not perfect by a long way, but it's certainly better than it was. So there we have it. So I'm not going to be too much longer, so I'll talk to you again when it comes to the part where I'm going to need to put some primer on it. So it's absolutely hoofing it down outside. It's grey and just raining. So if you can hear anything out there, that's what that is. But here we are. I've done all the prep work. All of these parts are good to go just to start painting on them, and so is this, but this is going to need a little bit more work before we actually start painting it. So just to show that second wing seam, there is slightly more of a gap there, so you can see that black filler just slightly more strongly on that one. And then flipping it over, you can see I've been around everywhere with the Vallejo, which I've usefully put back in my drawer. There we go, with the Vallejo plastic putty, so that's just squeezed into those gaps and then damp cotton budded off to leave the worst bits of these these undercarriage doors obviously. But everywhere where there was something that looks like a gap, kind of like that joint line to that control surface looks like a gap, anywhere where there's anything like that, I've been over it with that putty, including the joint for the radome. So that's that. If you can be sharp-eyed, you can see there's a little, they're fairly subtle sink marks here, top of the sides of the intakes, and also the aft edge of this, the end of the wing, and in fact even the flaperons themselves have a slight suggestion of a sink mark. I should fix that, but I'm not going to, particularly in the case of these areas. If I angle that, you can see it fairly strongly. It's going to be basically impossible to properly fill that and get it all flush without completely removing that U-shaped raised detail. So I'm just going to politely ignore, same on here, just down that leading edge, and in fact even on the bottom, and it's because of that thick part inside where the intakes butt up to it. So that's ready. I'm going to put some primer on that and I'll show you that in just a second. All of these parts were just smoothed off where necessary and the ultra glue removed. The only differences being ejection seat had a very prominent joint line smack bang down the middle of that head box, so I've just cut a piece of thin plastic card to go around all that detail, just cover it up. Much easier than trying to fill it. The other difference is the wheels. So I did modify and improve this one, as I already showed you, but I've today taken the decision to order in a set of brassing wheels that replaces all three of these. It's not just the tread detail, it's actually, the deciding factor is actually the weighted effect on these wheels. It's too much. That isn't a weighted tyre, that's a flat tyre. And combined with that issue of the crown, you can see I've sanded this one some, and that gives you a good representation of actually to just how much curvature there is on the part that is meant to be set on the ground. So that was the deciding factor, honestly, was this curvature, because if I take that completely out, then it really is a flat tyre, not a bulged and weighted one. So I've decided to get some brassing resin ones in. They're £5 or £5.99, so they weren't expensive, and I had to order some decals anyway for this, which we'll come on to that later, so they're on the way. Primer then. Why am I going to put primer on this? Well, it's not to show me flaws. I don't agree with the concept of using a primer coat to show potential flaws in the finish. You should be able to, and you should train yourself to and get used to being able to spot those flaws without the use of extra layers of paint. In a majority of cases, especially with modern kits with such fine detail, adding extra layers of paint is it's not useful. You're better to keep your paint layers to a minimum and to a minimum thickness. The only reason I would utilise an overall primer coat in order to address surface defects is if the model has a heavy texture. This does occur. I have done it. You've seen me do it. The SU57 was a case in point. I blanket primed that whole thing with aerosol primer and then rubbed it down, and that was to enable me to remove the texture in that plastic, either by smoothing it over by the addition of that extra thickness of paint, or by sanding right through and it acting as a guide coat. In this case, the reason I will add primer is to cover up this black, because the colour that I'm going to use on this model, I do not want these areas of heavy colour change. I want a uniform or very close to uniform colour across the model, so as to minimise the amount of paint I have to put on. And all I'm going to do, honestly, is use Mr. Surfacer. This is Mr. Surfacer 500, it's nearly gone. It's maximum gloopy. And And in this instance, what I'm going to do is going to get some surface of glue, pin the lid here. This is a horrible old brush. It's just nasty, and I'm going to brush it onto all the areas that are scratched from the operation of filling. And having said what I just did, I will probably end up looking at this now, adding some sort of grey base coat to this anyway, because this is too much of a colour difference just as it is. But this is quite a thick, quite a heavy bodied paint, even if you utilise the thinner that's in it. You can see how thick it is. I can get the light on it, you can see the texture in that. It's not going to completely obliterate detail if it goes over it, but it's plenty thick enough to take up the slack with the scratches in the plastic from that filling. And that has been left at this level, which is about 240 grit. I haven't sanded it back with anything finer from there. But across there's made a bit of mess of that end with a drop of glue. So I'm just literally going to go around all the areas I've been sanding, like so, with a brush coat of this Mr. Surface of 500. So to sand it, I use wet and dry, specifically, vast majority of the time, P800 wet and dry, preferably the 3M variety. It is just a lot better quality than most of the alternatives out there. And I use it wet. If you use it dry, you know what I mean, of course it will work, but it will clog up very quickly and you'll use a lot of paper, and it does sand less efficiently. It's simply a case of carefully rubbing it out until it's smooth. But how do you know when it's smooth? Well, just by looking at it really. If you hold it in the light where you can get the light to reflect off it, you'll be able to see it will sort of develop a sheen because it's smooth, and you'll be able to look at that sheen and you'll see any dull areas that aren't sanded yet. If you're not convinced by that and you're concerned that you won't see anything, you could spray a thin layer of a dark colour over it, which will act as what's known in the motor finishing trade as a guide coat. And when you sand it, you simply sand until you can see no trace of that darker colour, and then you're ensured a smooth finish. So you'll have smoothed out all the scratches and imperfections and perfectly blended the primer into the rest of the kit surface, because that is also a thing. Now, when I talk about removing scratches, I'm just going to do a little diagram to show you what I mean. I'm sure the vast majority of you understand completely, but I'll show you anyway. So let's pretend this, I've just broke my pencil straight away. This is the surface of the model after we've sanded, magnified many times, with lots of unevennesses like so. We then add a primer layer over the top, like so, and this will, to a greater or lesser degree, will conform pretty much to the texture in the plastic. And then when we sand it, we remove the top of that primer to end up with a smooth, flat, level surface, and the primer itself filling in all of those scratches and marks and dents and troughs that are in the surface of the model. Clearly, if you have very large scratches or imperfections in the surface, then even something like Mr. Surfacer won't fill them in one application, and sometimes you do need to go backwards and forwards and put more than one application of primer on the model. but essentially with experience you'll learn to hit the happy medium where you prepare it well enough before you put the primer on so that one application will do the job. But anyway, I shall get on and sand all this out. Right, now with that all sanded down, what you're left with looks like that. Now you can see that in fact pretty much all of that mist surface is actually gone. You can also see though that there's no nasty marks in there. You can see what looks like scratches, but that's simply where the Mr. Surfacer is still in the bottom of the sanding marks. That's all that is. It's smooth as you like. And from here, because of what I'm going to do with the colour scheme of this thing, I do want the whole thing to be the same colour or near about the same colour. So what I've done over here is I've painted over the now sanded and smooth wing root with this stuff. It says XF54, but it isn't really. I darkened it quite considerably with some lacquer-based black. I can't remember why, but what I've got is this colour, which is remarkably similar to the colour of the plastic, which is what I noticed when I was spraying inside the cockpit. So I've sprayed that over the sanded down Mr. Surfacer, and I've then just quickly gone over it real quick with this blue sort of fine sanding sponge. Did the same out on the wingtip where the repair was out there of that sink mark, and as you can see, I hope from the reflection, the general finish, that wing root joint is now absolutely invisible, and I can spray the final colour finish over that and I won't have any issues with these repaired areas showing up as dark spots. Talking of painting the cockpit, obviously I masked all the way around this. I sprayed inside the tub with the same dark sea grey, which coincidentally this colour now is more like actual dark sea grey than it ever was before. Then very tediously masked that lower area, and I've sprayed the top part black with Tamiya LP5 lacquer paint, which is a really nice, I like LP5 very much for just the finish that it gives. I do like it. Obviously there's more to do in there, and obviously I could have painted this after everything else, but I will probably do the detail work before I put the main finish on. Whilst I was doing that, obviously I still have LP5 in the airbrush, so I decided I needed to paint the canopy. So the inside of this needs painting. Remember, it's got all those additional detail parts. So the first step for me for painting the inside of a canopy is to mask the outside. And the reason for that is that there's a dog wall going on outside. I'm sorry about that. The reason for that is that I can now, looking from the inside, very, very clearly see where the frame is. The moulded framework is. So I can now mask the inside quite easily to match that. Whereas trying to do it just with the visual cue of that slightly textured area would have been very, very difficult. The exterior is masked with a combination of bare metal foil, obviously you can see where that is, and Tamiya tape. The reason for that being, with these curved canopy frames, Tamiya tape can do that, and obviously you can burnish it down and cut around it, but it is quite hard to see the edges a lot of the time. Whereas with bare metal foil it's very, very easy, and it's also easier to cut than Tamiya tape, so you run less risk of damaging the actual transparency. But the straight edges along the sides are as easy as you like to cut with a thin to mask with a thin strip of Tamiya tape, which I simply cut with a steel rule into sort of 1.5–2mm strips, and then I've filled it in with Tamiya tape. And that is because bare metal foil is an awful lot more expensive than Tamiya tape, so rather than using it all over, I filled it in with tape. Well, I finally have it all masked, and it's taken a long time. It's taken longer to mask it than it took to sand it all down and fill it and prime it and sand it again. It's taken a long time. So this is the extent of it. Obviously I have to mask off the lift fan itself and the doors behind it, the canopy inside and out, and then the black is sprayed inside and out. The outer frame has a coat as well. Then underneath this area here, I chose, I've already mentioned I'm going to do something a little bit off the wall with this, and I chose to leave this, or to have this area in grey, so that's done. And all the wheel wells and this other duct and the intakes. As you can see, it's all been done with Tamiya tape, and the majority, or an awful lot of it, because of all these angular shapes, basically got some 10mm tape on the table here. I used the rule to cut it in half, and then just lots and lots of squares like this, lots of squares, and just putting them into all the angles and working my way around all the apertures, and then filling in as and where I feel like I need to with slightly larger pieces of tape. But because of all of these teeth and angles, it has taken quite a while, but we're there now. And the next step is I am going to cover up all these different bits and pieces of colour with the grey as per this wing route. And here it is then, all one colour again. Remember I said that last reason for priming, to get everything the same colour if you've got a finicky finish, so a colour that doesn't like covering other colours or mixed colours like red, for example. Now in this case, I'm going to paint this white. I mean, the title of the video and the thumbnail's already given it away, obviously, but I'm going to paint this thing white. So let's talk about colour for a minute. The colour this thing is supposed to be painted in is FS 36170, a colour called Have Glass 5, a stealth paint, which has got this metallic finish to it, twinkly, shape shifting, colour shifting sort of properties. Previously seen obviously on F-22s and other things, and now even painting F-16s with it now. I don't pretend to know the ins and outs of why it sparkles or looks the way it does. Clearly it's got some sort of metallic particles in it for radar reflectivity. So in modelling terms, how do we replicate that? There are several pre-mixed ready-made Have Glass 5 variants on the market. I've looked into it obviously, and I thought about ordering one, but then I happened across a post on an internet forum, modelling forum, where the guy compared all the available Have Glass 5 mixes he could get hold of, and did a couple of custom personal mixes as well, and placed all the results in one photo with an official federal standard colour chip to sort of compare how these model finishes look against what they should, and just as importantly how they compare to each other. And what really caught my eye was one of his mixes, which looked better than all of the pre-mixed paints to my eye anyway, which was made from a base of RLM 75, the Luftwaffe World War II colour, which obviously I have here on the shelf. So I utilised that information, and I used what was left in this old jar. This is Gunsei Sangyo Aqueous, so it's hobby colour, H69 RLM 75 grey. It's all gone now. I used what was left in the jar, and I mixed it 4:1 with this. This is Alclad Gold Titanium, or ALC-118, which I think possibly isn't available in this format, but I do know that Ammo of MiG are now producing or marketing these. So 4:1 with that. That's in this jar here, and I added a splash, maybe 2-4% of LP5, because to my eye when that was mixed it looked a touch light, and this is what I've got. This is the colour, and it looks stripy, but it's not. It's just that it's metallic, so all of a sudden this slight bulge towards the bottom of the fin is very, very visible. Now you can see that it has a sort of a colour changing feel to it, and at no risk of getting in trouble because this is my own photograph, is a Royal Air Force F-35B at the International Air Tattoo, and I think the video camera's making this look awful, but to my eyes it works quite well, and it looks reasonable. So that's that. But I just said I was going to paint it white, so I'll explain the thought process there and indeed why this fin is not white. So this model, even before I built it, and especially before I spent the week at Riyadh looking at real F-35s, there are multiple F-35s there this year, and I think possibly for the first time pretty much, they were parked in a static area, easily accessible and visible, relatively close up. But I also, because of the fact that I was working at the show, I'm a volunteer at Riyadh, I do aircrew transport, so I drive a minibus up and down the flight line for a week. I spoke to the guards of one of the Dutch aircraft and was able to jump the rope and get really close to the aircraft and have a good look at it with my eyes and speak to the guard, who happened to be actually a paint technician in the Dutch Armed Forces, and his sole job in life was to look after the said paint finish and the various strips of sealing material on top of it, and it was a very interesting chat. But with all of that side of the real thing, it did make me realise that this kit really isn't terribly accurate. The depiction of this zigzag stuff, we'll stick to calling it ram tape for simplicity's sake, but it's not strictly what it is. It's horribly inaccurate, especially these nose areas. It's so over the top. It really is absurdly big, harsh, in your face. It's just not nice. So I had decided because of that I wasn't really going to take this build seriously, shall we say, and I mean that in the best possible way, and I decided to do a what if paint scheme, even though in absolute fairness to the kit, I think I showed it earlier on in the video, but I do think the US Marine Corps variant that's supplied, this one, I do think that's actually quite attractive, to be honest. But I digress. I decided to do a what if, and so I started thinking back along the timeline for 617 Squadron, and initially, clearly, I thought in terms of doing a sort of a Lancaster bomber inspired scheme of dark green, dark earth over black, but I wanted to pick out these tapes in grey as well, and I did not think that would look good on that finish. Likewise, I think the obvious choice for a sort of flashback scheme with 617, especially for a fast jet, I think is probably the wraparound Tornado. But again, I'm not convinced it would look great with the tapes picked out. So again, I'm casting around, and I came up with two possibles. The Gulf War Desert Pink, because 617 did take tornadoes out there. But what I've ultimately decided to go with actually is anti-flash white from the Vulcan era, because 617 Squadron operated Vulcans for over 20 years, and in the early days they were anti-flash white. And on top of that, I have had in the old Decal stash this sheet in 72nd. I've obviously since purchased it in 48th for this job, but one of the schemes therein is this 70th anniversary Tornado with the special fin. So I think it's probably all becoming clear at this point, but the plan is to use some variation of this tail art on the have glass fins, both of them, with the rest of the aircraft being white and using the low visibility roundels that are meant for these Typhoons, because I don't have any anti-flash white roundels, and I actually also don't think they'd look very good because they would look too old-fashioned, and I just don't think it'll work. It's such a modern aircraft. So I'm going to go with the standard sort of low-vis style roundels that they're on the sheet for the Typhoons. Here they are, these, with some sort of tail art built up from these decals, or some of them. And hopefully it won't look completely stupid, but of course, to add to the visual interest, I will pick out these greys, so it'll be white with all the grey tapes, metallic grey fins with the art on them. I think it should look quite eye-catching. Well, I hope so anyway. And it relieves the inner dialogue that I have to try hard at making it accurate, because at this point I feel that to make this kit look accurate would be way too much effort, really. If I just bring this picture up again of this is, stop being stupid phone. What has it done? There we go. This is an RAF F-35B. Look at that. So this whole big square humpback thing that this kit's got going on, it isn't really representative. The real thing doesn't look anywhere near as clunky and chunky as this does. These boxy corners around here, they're not there. You can see that, I hope. So in summary, I feel like the best option for me to finish this kit is just to go completely off the script and do a what if. So I've got some white paint. I've got a lot of white paint. I've got my mixture for the fins, and I'll also use this mixture and maybe a couple of other slightly different mixtures to pick out these tapes, because clearly I haven't had enough of masking yet. and we'll see where it ends up and how it ends up looking. Alright then, it's all white. So this has taken a little bit of time. It's been painted white with Tamiya. It's in an XF2 jar, but it's actually mostly LP4, which is the lacquer paint, flat white. It does have XF2 in it, but I just chucked it in this jar because I needed a fresh jar to mix the have glass colour with the RLM75, which I used the LP4 bottle for. So yeah, I sprayed it with the matte white, 3 or 4 coats, smooth, nice, sort of wet but not thick coats, as previously discussed on the channel. That was left to dry overnight, gave it a quick sort of nib off, a little bit of a rub just to get rid of any sort of scrubbly areas, because I do find the lacquer paints have a tendency to pebble up if you're not careful. And with the model, it's not massive, but it's large enough with sort of lots of big areas to spray, lots of overspray going everywhere. It is a thing. So knock that back, and then I got a bit imaginative because I thought, well, so much of the stealth characteristics of these things is actually bound up in the finish, the coatings used on the outside and all the rest of it, that even though this is going way off script, this special scheme, this is not something that I think will ever happen, but I figured, what if actually we had a sort of a stealth version of the white paint with a sparkle. So I got this. This is lacquer paint again, LP43 Pearl White, obviously meant for vehicles and motorcycles primarily, I expect. But what I did was I took that and I cut it about probably 60-40 with X22, so it's so there's a lot more carrier and a lot less sparkle basically. Then that was heavily thinned with Mr. Colour as usual, and a coat of that was sprayed over the white, and then I have sprayed one coat of basic X22 clear over the top of that, and this is the result. it looks a lot more like a spaceship now, bizarrely, because I don't think spaceships are generally metallic white, but you can see all the curves a lot better because they reflect back just ever so subtly, and you've got that sort of colour shift and that sort of transformery, robot-y sort of metallic look that these things have. It is a little bit, if I come somewhat closer, hopefully you can physically see the sparkles on that. It is probably, well no, it is too sparkly at the minute, but the flat finish that will go on it at the end will dull that down massively, so I'm not too worried at this point. The other thing I did was I mixed another grey with some titanium, the gold titanium alclad. This is a mixture I found in my drawer. I've got a drawer on the left side there with all the bits and pieces I've mixed up. A lot of them have got bits of tape on, like this has now, that tell me what's inside them, but this one didn't. But it was just a nice palish grey, so I just topped that up with a touch of this gold titanium alclad to make the lighter colour, to pick out these sort of edges and zigzags and things like shown in the instructions. So the vast majority of what gets picked out on here will actually be this lighter colour, and the only thing that's going to end up being painted in the original grey that I've mixed is the fins, which is that's also received a coat of gloss. So the reason for the coat of gloss at this stage, it's not to make it decal proof, it's simply to give a measure of protection to this finish and that finish, which, because there's now going to be another massive masking session to get all of this grey stuff put on, and hopefully that will really just lift the model visually, because at the minute it's just a big white thing. So I do think as well, I'm hoping actually that painting all these raised areas of stealth coating I'm hoping it will actually make them look less obvious in a way, but we'll see. On the side here I have a tray covered in a mighty assortment of doors and panels, most of which are only painted on one side at this point. Gloss white on the insides, which is LP2, and the outsides are going with the matte white, the pearl coat, and the gloss the same. So they're all at different levels. Remembering also that the hot panels, that is these two and these two, need to be dark metallic grey on the inside rather than white. And in a further aside, I have received now the brassing wheels I ordered. So here's the packaging. These were, I think, $5.99 from Hannant's. 3 resin moulded wheels plus a mask set from tape. I never really end up using the masks. I think they're really more bother than just using a paintbrush, to be honest. But the biggest reason I got them was this tread issue. The kit wheels, that's the one I modified. The kit wheels, the treads are shocking. They're not really there at all. And they're really a very prominent feature on aircraft tyres, these big deep radial treads. And they're quite hard. It's quite hard to make a good job of putting them in yourself. I didn't do too bad on this one. And I thought maybe I will just do it myself, but when I tried to do the nose wheel I was really struggling, so I decided to take the easy road and just buy some that someone else has done. If you want to compare and contrast detail wise, there's the back and there's the front. They are a significant improvement in every respect. The only thing I'm not keen on, honestly, is all this super overdone writing and sidewall detail. I'm not a big fan of that, but for the purpose of this model I'll leave it on. And the axles are still too long, so the axles will need to be trimmed down by probably about a mil and a half for these to fit properly. But there we go. This needs to sit now for a good amount of time to let all this white paint and pearl paint and clear paint really cure properly, so that I can safely mask and cut and spray different colours on top without risk of damaging it. masking. Really is all the fun, isn't it? So I thought I'd just quickly show you roughly how I'm doing most of this masking. So I'm doing it in sections because frankly to mask the whole thing and then spray the grey would take so long as to drive anybody to distraction. So I'm working in smaller sections at a time and just, you know, logical breakdown, do a bit of masking, do a bit of spray and keep myself engaged in that way. Initially, these areas around the nose, I was doing a lot of sort of get a piece of tape, line it up on one edge and then cut in situ, much like you would masking Canopy, but that has proved to be unsatisfactory because as you can see here, if I come close, maybe the camera will play ball, there's a couple of areas where the paint has lifted, and that's because when you cut the tape you inevitably score the paint to some degree as well, and it's just lifting it away from the plastic just a little bit. Sometimes as modellers we have to just accept that just good enough is good enough on occasion, and that is the case with that, because I'm certainly not going to go and spray all the white again, and because I put this pearl coat over the top, it's basically impossible to touch it up now without doing whole areas and panels. So I may do some very tiny touch up just to lessen the visual impact of that, but basically that's done. So I am not now cutting the tapes in situ to avoid that. The paint won't lift if it's not cut, so I'm not cutting on the model now. So all of this has been done in a slightly different way, and one of the easiest things to liken this to actually is when you mask the deck of a ship model. I've only done that once so far in my modelling career, but you basically just have a billion tiny squares of tape and you just put them down one at a time around all the shapes until it's all covered up, and that's essentially what's happening now. It isn't quite as bad as that, but as you can see here, for instance, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces of tape. I've just got the tape cut in half and cut into squares or rectangles, and I'm just laying them in one at a time to follow the zigzags, and in those situations that's easy to do. Yes, it's time consuming, but it isn't actually hard to do. However, when you get to inside corners like here and inside areas like here, you can't really do that, or you can't easily do that. So I'm going to show you how I've been dealing with those areas with this. Where have I put my piece of tape? I think this is it here, maybe. With a piece of tape. So this is just a piece of 6mm tape, standard. Nothing special, it's not been cut down at all. It's got bits of hair on it. And then I get the piece of tape and I align it with an edge of this area that needs masking. Any one of the edges, but only one of the edges basically. Whichever way you want to do it, it's up to you. I've cut this tape a little bit too close to the required size, so I've got to align it so that it actually covers the area that needs masking properly. There we go. Did we get it that time? No. There. Right, some faffing later. So I've got that piece of tape in situ, completely covering the area. I've aligned it on that top edge. Now, don't press it down too hard in the middle, because you want the piece of tape to be able to conform. And I'm using the back, not the front because that's sharp, this back rounded edge of my pointed tweezer to push the tape into this panel edge. The tweezers are sharp enough to do this, and they're strong enough not to be damaged. You need to be able to push it in fairly hard to get a nice crisp line. And they're sharp enough to do it without being so sharp that they'll cut the tape, basically. So you can see now that is pushed quite tightly into that panel, so you can very clearly see now where the edges are that you need to cut. And these areas on the nose that I was just talking about previously, I would have laid the scalpel into that corner and cut it in situ and then just peeled off the excess. But as you've seen, that was causing some paint to be lost, so I don't want to keep doing that. So mechanical pencil. This is a 0.35mm Faber-Castell mechanical pencil. I'm sure I probably got it off Amazon, but you need the fine kind, and it's got a fairly hard lead in it. I'll just put that into that corner as well. Corner's already made, and all I'm doing really is adding a bit of colour, a bit of guidance. And see how I'm drawing in to the corner. The lead's got an angle on it, and I'm putting that sharp angle into that bottom corner and drawing. Now, carefully peel it off. Try not to stick it down too well, because if you do, when you peel it off, you'll very, very slightly stretch and distort the piece of tape, and then it won't fit again when you pull it back. So I'm popping it down. I'm using my piece of white because the tape is opaque, and if the table kind of blocks out where I need to cut. And then I'm using my scientist glasses, and I can see both the indentation and actually the colour that I've left. And I simply cut along the lines that I've made. On them, or very, very slightly inside them, is where you need to be. If you cut along the outside edge of the line, the mask will be too big. Thus. Now, pick up your now pre-cut mask and just add it back into the space where you drew around it for a perfect fitted pre-cut mask. And yes, it is taking ages, but oh, the masking, oh my goodness. Well, so you already saw I started out by cutting in situ, and I've ended up with small amounts of paint loss because of doing that. So I switched to the method I've just shown you and did all this, and this took hours to mask up. It's really just no easy way to do it using small pieces, unless you use tiny pieces, I suppose. But the issue with that is the getting sort of less than straight lines, basically, where the pieces overlap. Now this is a long way from perfect. If you look at it closely, there are various areas where it's not quite right, or there's a little bit of a ragged edge or a bit of overspray, whatever. But viewed from any distance, it's good enough. So I'm here to give a top tip right now. It is massively easier to create these masks if you can cut them in situ like you would if you were masking a canopy. Now you're going to have to use tape, because foil will stick too well and you'll never get it, well, you're unlikely to get it to peel off well enough to then be able to reuse it as a mask. So with the tape though, you can lay it in, you can burnish it down, get it into the edges, you cut it out and then peel it away. So my top tip here at this point, for anybody who's lucky enough to be building one of these and wanting to mask all this out, is create yourself a set of masks before you ever start painting it. So when it's bare plastic, or even before you even build the thing, while you've still got a set of parts, it would even work, and probably be actually easier because the wings won't be in the way and such. Get your tape out and make masks for all these panels, all these areas that are inside the lines, and then just lay them back down onto I don't know, sheet of greaseproof paper, a bit of plastic card, anything really. They don't have to be pressed down tightly, just pop them back down. You can put them down in the order that they're going to go back onto the model to help you, you know, find where they're supposed to go. But pre-cutting them like that will allow for better accuracy, and any faint sort of cut marks that might be left in these edges aren't going to show by the time you put paint on and everything else. So that's the top tip at this point, is look at potentially having a go at making up a mask set before you start painting, using the sort of cutting out in situ method. At this point I've spent probably 4 to 6 hours masking this upper wing and these two areas here. It nearly sent me to the cranking house. Yeah, it nearly sent me batty, so I have backed off to something a little bit easier, and I'm going for quick wins, doing the tail feathers and just the area around the back, and that's key for me. Your mileage may vary, but I need to do it in sort of small pieces and then get a result to be able to continue on. Plus as well, trying to mask the entire thing for all of the areas to spray it on one go would actually make life a lot harder than it needs to be. So at this point I've got this wing to do, this area, and then the underside. The underside is considerably easier than the top. It hasn't got all this stuff going on, so we're getting there slowly. Well, here it is. I don't know how much tape I've used, but I can tell you it's a lot. This is what I've been using, all 3 sizes of Tamiya, with much cutting and slicing, but I have finally done it. Probably, oof, do you know, I wouldn't even like to say, somewhere between 12 and 20 hours worth of masking here to do this whole thing. But it is done, and there's the underside. I've just randomly done patches in grey. There's no real rhyme or reason to it, apart from what was easiest to mask, to be honest. These pieces were grey because the paint finish next to the landing gear legs was horrid, which is because it was all masked up. Kind of knew that might be an issue, and it was, so I just decided to scratch it down and paint those panels in grey. Likewise the centre line just would have been a bit of a git to mask, so I didn't bother. It is a whiff after all. But here we are, probably you know, pretty much a solid week of sessions of masking, and here it is with all its grey on. And right at this minute, I've got to be honest, I'm not even sure it looks good. We've got tails here. These are done thus. It's the underside, top sides. Not more they're gonna, yeah, just balance. Interesting fact here, the F-35B has quite considerable dihedral on its tail planes, which the A does not have. I'm not entirely sure why that is. Be interested to find out. And here are the fins. And again, these are the original, or shall we say the proper colours, as it would be if it were standard. Again, I've used a bit of artistic licence. There isn't as much light grey on these as there should be according to instructions, but since I'm going to cover them up with special artwork, I thought it doesn't really matter, does it? And you just pop everything into place. To be honest, I think it starts to look better. So I'm hopeful that with the addition of decals and whatnot that it will look quite good. But there it is so far, and as I said a minute ago, do yourselves a favour, if anybody's going to build this kit, create yourselves a set of masks before you put any paint on. It will save a heap of time. And now that the majority of the masking and finishing is done with this, once I've got everything masked and painted with this lighter grey colour, I have shot the whole thing with one wet coat of X22 as usual. This is thinned with Mr. Colour Thinner, not anything else. This is what I use, this exact stuff. Ratio probably, I'm going to say about 70-30 thinners to paint, so one wet coat. By wet I don't mean thick, I simply mean wet. which I demonstrated in a video before. So whilst this is hardening, it is dry enough to touch, obviously, because I have been, but it's not fully cured. So while that is doing that, I'm going to leave that overnight probably. I have here a plethora of smaller parts which will require attention, some of which are not yet white, as you can see. Some of them are grey, some of them will be other colours. I do still have one of the pitos, the other one is AWOL, but luckily the pitos are on the case sprue, which is repeated, so there were 4 pitos in the kit, so I'm not remotely concerned by that. But yeah, this will keep me busy for plenty long enough to give that clear coat a good amount of time to dry properly before I start hitting it with decals. Just so you can see what the heck I'm doing with this scheme, so I can't remember if I showed, but it's this decal sheet here. I had it in 72nd, I went ahead and bought another one in 48th, although actually this artwork was almost big enough in 72nd to work on the F-35 fin, because the Tornado has such a massive one. Here's what it looks like on the Tonka, with a black fin. So I didn't want to go with the grey for the Tornado. I didn't particularly want the black fin either. So I decided on this sort of Vulcan inspired anti-flash white scheme, which I've then made pearlescent white to make it more modern and stealthy. But how I've gone about it is as follows. So this is the decal for the fin, and as you can see, if I just put that against my fin, it's a lot bigger. But the issue, if you want to call it that, obviously this is designed to fit a Tornado, and the fin on the Tornado's got all sorts of bulges, and it's got that bare metal area where the exhaust is, which this part here is cut out for that, and then more cutouts around the curves. Then of course you've got the front of the fin here. I couldn't have any of that showing on this, so what I did was I cut the decal. Just got my steel rule. Work on camera please, woman. Okay. And basically went up the decal until the point where I didn't have anything interrupting this lower white line, and sliced it off, and that gave me this bit of excess, and meant that I could then put the decal down against this sort of bulged area at the bottom. And then I just eyeballed it and used the pencil on the back and everything else and cut it at an angle so I could butt it up to this forward line of tape, because it's just not quite wide enough. Once you cut it down to allow for this bottom straight edge, it isn't quite wide enough to go across the entirety of the fin, and I didn't want any sort of weird cutouts, and nor did I want, honestly, to be having to touch in this white. So that's why it butts up to there, and then it's just applied in the normal way, and it's worked out quite well. I think it's relatively well aligned with the fin, and if I come up close you can see, being an extra decal, it's very very thin, it conforms without any bother, and that's gone into there beautifully. Because it's so thin, it is very 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 easy to crinkle up this large clear area. It's always a problem with thin decals. They'll conform easily due to their nature, but you will still mostly need to use some sort of solvent on them, and it does wrinkle up the clear areas really really easily. And if you look very closely, there you go, you can probably see down here there's a couple of sort of marks, and this is where it sort of wrinkled, but as it dries it shrinks back to the point where once that's been overcoated with clear you won't see it anymore, especially just give it a little nib before any more clear goes on. So the number then is from the kit sheet. This is the part of the kit markings that I have. Again, those are cartograph, no issues there, they go on absolutely beautifully. And the only other thing I would venture to point out, I'm not sure if it's very visible, but the extra decals are out of register. If you can see that little white edge along the back of that fin flash. Same here on the roundel. I'd have liked bigger roundels, honestly, but I've got what I've got. The carrier film isn't actually lined up with the printing completely. So it's quite often a thing with extra decals. They are good, but the research is a little bit hit and miss, and sometimes the printing's not brilliant either, but you know, they're easy to get, they're cheap, so pay your money, etc. So that's what's happening with the fins. The rest of it's basically I'm using the kit stencils on it. These Live roundels, I'd have liked anti-flash roundels actually, but the only ones I have are for a Vulcan, and they're about this big. I thought I had a sheet of anti-flash roundels, but if I do I can't find it, so I decided to go with those. And also, being such a modern aircraft, I thought that the anti-flash roundels might date it a bit too much, might not quite work, whereas these do. But that's sad. I preferred it if they were a touch bigger, but that's what I've got. But I think it's working out quite well. Maybe I should have done the fins black, I'm not really sure. Again, the artwork would potentially stand out better against black or against an aircraft that wasn't already white. But I think it, you know, it's certainly going to stand out as something a little bit away from the norm. So there's a few to go. There's quite a few stencils, but it's not onerous really, it's not too bad. Well, I finally got all the decals on. There weren't that many stencils, but enough. I really dislike stencils, I'm not going to lie, and in a smaller scale I wouldn't have bothered with them at all. But with this being white overall, they do add a certain something to the finish if you look close enough. And once they're all on and dry, I have then, as you can probably tell, re-glossed it. So this is another single coat of the X22 with Mr. Colour. Again, quite a wet coat, but again, heavily thinned, literally 70-75% thinners. So it goes on nice and smooth. As you can see, we've got a nice finish there. And I do quite like it in this gloss finish as well, but I can't leave it like that because it's not consistently as smooth and nice as this. Now, one of the other big drawbacks with this crusty detail is how hard it is to keep your paint finish smooth, especially because, as in the case with this kit, this area in particular of the moulding was a little bit textured, not a lot, but just a little, and because you can't really sand it because of all this raised detail, that just, you know, kind of gets exacerbated as you start painting. So there's only so much you can do unless you start sanding the detail off. So I'm just living with it, but as a result of that, I'm not going to go with a gloss finish because you can see when you look at it closely that the finish, you know, it's not that smooth across here. So it is going to be matte coated, and I'll show you now where I go from that stage using a tail plane, and this is exactly the same. This has been painted, glossed, deckled, glossed again. We've got the same finish on that. So before I flat coat it, good old Trizact, bit of Trizact. Remember, of course, that I've got the beveled edges on this Velcro so as not to damage my parts, and I'm just going to very, very lightly sand across the part. Why? Just to smooth it out, help blend the decals in, and scuff up the surface to give my very water-based acrylic matte varnish a chance to really stick to this surface. It should stick anyway with the gloss, but this will help it. And the other side benefit of sanding it, as it just dulls the finish down a touch, because this is fairly shiny now, and it's shiny enough that the matte lacquer will struggle to really knock that back without putting a lot on, which I don't want to have to do. So there we go. That's sanded now. I think in the footage it'll still look pretty shiny, but you can see there that's scuffed up. So once it's like that, I'm then going to apply the flat varnish, which is VMS satin. Here it is totally shaken. VMS satin. Best flat coat I've used yet. It's hard to show because it comes over here, but this is quite thick in the bottle, and I have experimented. You can thin it, you can use IPA or the Tamiya acrylic thinner X20, but when thinned it tends to lose its properties a little bit, I have found. So bite the bullet, get yourself a thick needle for your airbrush and apply it as it is, and make sure and put a wet coat on, and that is difficult because it doesn't want to go through the airbrush, but you need a wet coat, and it will look horrible because of the water. It sort of magnifies all of the lumpiness and everything else, but just trust the process, let it dry, and it will be good, I promise. On top of that, we've got the exhaust parts painted, the weapons, and their multitude of colours, although the GPUs are refreshingly simple, but there are quite a few decals for them. I've also painted the wheels and tyres. I've sprayed the centres and I've just painted tyres black with XF85 with a paintbrush so far. So that's them. And yeah, I've just got a desk full of parts right now, and I'm just sort of working my way through them, getting them all to sort of similar places so that I can flat coat in batches and do everything in batches to speed everything up. Right, I've got a couple of things to point out about this canopy. So you'll recall I masked it, it's been sprayed inside and out, so the insides are all black, the outsides are all grey. I like spraying the insides because you get a nice, when you look at the canopy on an angle like this, you get this nice effect of sort of being able to see that inner framework, and it gives it a nice sort of 3D dynamic that I quite like. But if I bring it up tight, anyone who's ever masked with bare metal foil will immediately recognise this. Even though it's not been on there all that long, a week or so, the bare metal foil will always leave this sticky residue, which is genuinely a pain in the bottom to get off. So this is Genesis top tip number 98.7. The way to get this sticky residue off is, ta-da, WD-40. So I've got a massive can here, but any size can will do, or you can get that stuff that's in a jug. That's probably actually a lot easier. But you just need to get some out in your chosen way. You can spray it into a container or just try and get it straight onto a cotton bud. You'll inevitably make a mess when you try to spray it straight onto the cotton bud, and please do test it on some clear before you put it on your canopy. So by that, this is the clear sprue from the kit. I've got my WD-40 soaked cotton bud, and I'm just putting that on there and making sure it doesn't have a reaction. It shouldn't do, but if I tell everybody that it will not react, there's always going to be that one, isn't there, where it does. Do please check before you use anything on transparencies. So yeah, I've got some in the end of this cotton bud, and I'm just going to rub that across the adhesive, and it just takes it straight off. Tiny piece of foil still stuck on there. Just tease that off. So that's got all that off. But obviously the canopy is now covered in WD-40 residue, so get your nice soft cloth and just gently buff your canopy clean. And there we have it, looking just a little bit better. The other point to note, just up here at the back, the internal part, this sort of, please focus, this internal piece that was put in, I didn't really think to check properly. I just assumed it wouldn't be able to be seen. But if you look there, just here, you can actually see it. So what you're going to need to do with that, I think I'm just about getting away with it, but paint the top edge of this part, and then when it's glued in, just glue it in with either a touch of CA down the bottom only, or use something like the ultra glue type stuff that dries clear, so you don't have an ugly sort of glued piece of plastic visible there in the top of your canopy. But yeah, there you go, top tip, use of WD-40 to remove bare metal foil residue and restore clarity to this previously sticky and unattractive canopy. Right, that is about it. We're pretty much done. I have coloured in and decalled all the weapons. I have caught up with all the panels, put the grey edging around them, matte coated everything. The canopy's all back together as you saw the last time. The only things that are not quite painted yet are the seat. Now, from what I can see in my picture I got at Riyadh, the RAF one has got a black head cushion. So I think the cushions might well be black on it, so I think I'm just going to pick the belts out on that and call it a job. Or I might cover it with silver foil, because every other F-35 at Riyadh had these metallic silver spaceship blankets over the ejection seats. So I thought they looked kind of fun. Build and ties are painted. I have put some wash on things, not a lot. I just made up a little bit of wash using a touch of oil brusher Starship Bay sludge. It's a good sort of general dirty colour, with some white spirit, not white spirit, enamel thinners, and I've just used that to make the panels in the cockpit stand out a little, and I used it on the undercarriage legs, the wheels and the exhaust area, just to sort of add a bit of tone to those. I haven't put any wash anywhere else because I just don't want it. This thing's white, sparkly. It's a show plane, it's a demo plane, it's the Lightning Display Team plane, so it's going to be clean, and that's the end of it. I think there's some justification, again, having looked around the ones at Riyadh. The only one, and some people won't be at all surprised by what I'm about to say, but the only one that showed any sign of dirtiness was the RAF one. The wheels and the lower portions of the legs on that were visibly smutty, whereas all of the others were immaculate. Just as a quick look, here are the weapons in their final state. So we've got the GBU. This is H308. It's got a little sort of beige dust cap thing going on, decals as per the instructions. The old JDAM. There's only one decal for these in the instructions, and that's the yellow ring for the nose, which didn't remotely fit, so I've just painted a little ring on the nose there with a brush. And then the AIM-9s, these are quite pretty. Bit of a faff to paint all the different colours. Whoopsie. But the decals look they look like multicoloured party missiles there on their funny little crank pylons. So everything's ready to go together. As you can see from where I flipped it over, I have started putting some of the doors on already. It takes a minute. You have to sort of let things settle in and set up, and keep an eye on them while the glue's going off, so they don't all go horribly wrong while you're not looking. I've put the sensor thing in its window in at the front, and yeah, it's coming along rapidly. So I am just going to continue popping pieces on, putting it together, and we will be done very, very soon. And there it is, done. There weren't really any issues with final assembly, as you'd imagine, because it's already been together once after all said and done. There were a couple of small points. So one of them is my mistake. So the doors here, for sort of, I don't honestly know what that's for, this engine air intake when the lift fan's going. I have fitted these covers the wrong way round, so they're back to front. It's not possible for them to be the right way around because I've put them on the wrong backings. I don't remember if I followed the instructions or if I just did it. I can't remember, so I can't honestly say. I can't claim that's Italu's fault. It's probably mine. The other problem was with the wheels, so I'm gonna have to hold it now. It's got all this stuff sticking out on the top. I bought the brassing resin wheels because the kit ones, the flats on the tyres are a bit silly, if you recall. So I have shortened the axles, as I said I would have to, but in all three cases the aperture within the wheel is slightly larger than the axle, so they're a little bit sloppy. That's not really a massive issue as such, because obviously glue can take up the space. I used ammo glue to initially hold them, and then I've just touched a little bit of super glue in there to fix them in place, as it were, because ammo glue takes such a long time to set, and the wheel was tending to want to kind of sag while it was still setting, so I used just a touch of super glue to hold it in place to allow that ammo glue to go off without the wheel moving. So yeah, there's a little bit of slop there. If you wanted to, you could probably investigate shimming that with some brass tube or whatever, but I just went for gluing it in place. But there's the underside. You can see all our weaponry there, and all our open panels and doors and such, and of course the swivelling transformer nozzle. To give you a bit better view of that. I've no clue if these colours are representative of the real one or not. I've just painted it so it looks nice, to be honest. I mean, the whole thing is make-believe, so it seems a bit silly to worry too much about ultimate accuracy everywhere. Just to give you a side profile with that, the artwork on those fins. There you go. There's not many places left to hold it by either. I will of course take some photographs to put alongside these words. Put you down again. So there, finished White Lightning. So as I said before, this is a sort of a what if special scheme to act as a tribute to the 617 Squadron Vulcan nuclear deterrent. As I said at the beginning of the video, 617 operated the Vulcan for a number of years, probably second only to the Tornado, but it seems to be forgotten in all the special schemes. The scheme this is actually based on had the Lancaster on there, but not the Vulcan. So I thought it'd be okay. I thought it might look nice being white. As you know, I made it sparkly in the stealth style. It's hard to see. You can see it with the naked eye. I'm not sure it will come across on the video or not. I decided that white would look good with the grey ram tapes. I'm at this point still not sure it does. I don't think the jet looks bad in white overall, but I'm still not sure that the grey works with it. I don't really know, but it's finished anyway. So quite an enjoyable project all round, both in the build phase and the finishing phase that this is. Apart from masking up all that grey, all those zigzags, that was a nose. That more than doubled the time it took to finish this model from where it was at the end of the Bare Naked build video, and it just wasn't fun. There's no way I can package that without lying to say that it was fun. It really wasn't. It was incredibly frustrating. It took an incredibly long time. It wasn't flat out difficult particularly, just time consuming. The best thing I can say there for anybody that's building something like this, because I don't believe there are aftermarket mask sets for these things yet. I do suspect that the aftermarket might be missing a trick there, but then on the other hand, would they fit properly? I don't know. So yes, the tip would be with that, for anyone doing something like this where they know they're going to have to do this masking, is to create a set of all these internal shapes before you ever put any paint on it, so you don't have to worry about damaging or lifting off paint in the creation of the masks. You can set them aside, stick them to a plastic bag or a bit of plastic card or something, just stick them gently, and it will speed proceedings up considerably and lead to a cleaner finished result. There are lots and lots of faults on this when you look closely. It's a very long way from perfect, believe me, but it is finished. So yes, overall the kit, I mean, I've got two kind of threads on this. It's a decent kit as a model kit and nothing else. It's a decent kit. It goes together quite well. The detail is adequate. You've got a good selection of weaponry, which you can't always say. Everything's there. It's decent. There are no big issues with building it either. But as a replica of the F-35B, I'm considerably less impressed. It somehow looks boxy and chunky in relation to the real thing, in a way that the real thing just doesn't. As much as the F-35B is a little bit portlier than the A, it is not to the extent that this model suggests. It still looks very sleek, very sharp, and frankly very fast in real life. And this model just doesn't. It just looks a little bit fat, honestly, and also angular. And that might seem an odd thing to say because it's a stealth jet, they're all about the angles, yes, but things like this area here, it's much more boxy and much sharper edged on the model than it is on the real thing. The real thing is very svelte despite this extra mass up here, so I don't think it's a great replica, and especially in terms of the details, I don't know whether they guessed at it or not, because Italy do use these, but yeah, as a replica it's not great. I think if you want to build a serious replica of an F-35B, then you're not probably going to enjoy this kit that much. The ram tape's a whole other issue. I've said many times throughout the first video and this one that I'm just not a fan of how pronounced it is. I have, bizarrely enough, now that I've picked it out in colour, it doesn't look as bad because your eye's drawn to the colour rather than the raised nature of the detail. Again, if this were a serious build, I probably would have incurred an immense time penalty by sanding it all off and masking it all up separately. But, so yeah. Simplify all that waffle to say, as a kit it's decent, as a replica not so much. In terms of the price, 60ish in the UK, I don't know what it retails for elsewhere. It's a lot of plastic, it's quite a heavy model. I think realistically, given today's market, it's pretty much worth what they're asking for it if you can get it at 60 or less. But as I say, whether you want to pay that much for something that's only a passing replica is completely up to you. So there it is done then. A quick and silly finish to a quick and silly build in the first place. White lightning. And obviously there is a reference there to a particular type of alcohol that anybody my age probably got absolutely broken on when they were younger. Hopefully not more than once. And I've got to be honest, the more than once thing is going to strike me with this particular white lightning as well. I can't see me doing another one like this willingly. She says with a Tamir F-35 sat right behind her. As ever, thank you so much to the people who do directly support this channel through the Buy Me a Coffee app. Feel free to do so if you wish. It certainly isn't mandatory though. And with that said, it only remains for me to say, look after yourselves, look after each other. Genesis out.